Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here because today we're unpacking an absolute regulatory earthquake that's basically shaking up the entire corporate world right now. We're talking about June 7, 2026. See, this was supposed to be a massive milestone date for equal pay across Europe, but instead, it's turned into this incredibly high-stakes legal trap that's catching multinational corporations completely off guard. Look, if you run a business, advise one, or invest in one, the ground beneath your feet has permanently shifted, and doing nothing is just no longer an option.
Okay, I want to hit you right out of the gate with a pretty shocking statistic. Out of 27 European Union member states, guess how many actually managed to hit the mandatory transposition deadline for the EU Pay Transparency Directive? 4. Just 4. That leaves 23 member states sitting in varying stages of delay and non-compliance. Regulators obviously wanted this nice, orderly, unified rollout across the continent, but what we have instead is a deeply fragmented compliance map. And honestly, it's going to create an enormous headache for any employer trying to manage a workforce across borders. But the why behind all of this is actually really fascinating. Why did the EU Council unleash this binding legislation back in April 2023 to begin with? Well, it all boils down to this one incredibly stubborn number, 12 to 13%. Because despite decades, and I mean literally decades, of equal pay legislation across Europe, the gender pay gap has stayed completely frozen right around that 12 to 13% mark. So, this massive regulatory framework wasn't just built for fun. It was built specifically to eradicate that gap by dragging everything out into the open.
So let's untangle this legal mess step by step. First, we'll look at the missed EU deadline. Second, unpacking the new rules. Third, the fragmented compliance map. Fourth, the shifting burden of proof. And finally, why businesses must act. Section 1. The missed EU deadline and the June 7, 2026 fallout.
Let's look at what actually happened right after that deadline hit. The landscape is totally divided. On one side, you have your gold star students, right? Slovakia, Italy, Lithuania, and Malta. They got their homework done and successfully enacted their local legislation on time. But then look at the other side. Major European economies like the Netherlands, Sweden, the Czech Republic, and Denmark. They've delayed their target dates all the way to January 2027. So imagine you're a multinational corp with teams in, say, Italy and the Netherlands. You are now dealing with this incredibly uneven playing field where your legal obligations are totally live in one country and completely up in the air in another.
Moving on to Section 2, unpacking the new rules of Directive EU 2023/970. Now keep in mind, this touches every single organization employing staff in an EU member state, period. It doesn't matter where your headquarters is located. And these obligations are massive. They're going to totally upend standard HR practices. First off, employers of all sizes have to be ready to give workers, upon request, written information about their individual pay, plus the average pay for comparable work broken down by sex. Second, you've got to report on mean and median gender pay gaps, and yep, that includes bonuses and variable pay. Third, asking candidates about their pay history, totally banned. And finally, relying on those old pay secrecy clauses in your employment contracts, strictly prohibited.
The whole timeline for this is essentially a staggered ticking clock. We had the initial adoption back in April 2023, that really messy transposition deadline in June 2026, and now the delayed target date sitting in January 2027. But I really want you to zero in on June 2027. That is when the very first formal gender pay gap reports are due for employers with 150 to 249 employees, and for those with over 250 employees, who, by the way, have to report annually after that. The clock is loudly ticking toward that reporting deadline.
All right, Section 3, the fragmented compliance map and the compliance gray zone.
We really need to talk about why this delayed rollout is actually a huge trap for anyone with a distributed workforce. You might be sitting there thinking, hey, my country delayed the legislation, so I've got a breather, right? Actually, scratch that, absolutely not. You are now sitting right in the middle of what legal experts call a compliance gray zone. See, technically, EU directives aren't directly applicable until they become local law. But here's the catch. Local courts can, and very likely will, start reinterpreting existing national equal pay laws to match the directive's really strict standard of equal pay for work of equal value. So if you're just sitting back doing nothing, assuming you're safe until your local law passes, you are completely exposed to courts penalizing you right now.
And don't think for a second that national borders are going to protect you from this scrutiny either. We are already seeing a massive global ripple effect. Even countries totally outside the EU are adapting. Montenegro is already jumping in to implement the directive's requirements. And over in the UK, this recent Court of Appeal ruling involving Tesco has sent absolute shockwaves through the corporate world. Basically, predominantly female store workers successfully argued that their work is of equal value to predominantly male distribution center workers. It's a really intense, real-world reminder that how you assess job roles is under a microscope right now.
Which brings us to Section 4, the shifting burden of proof. And guys, this is a really dangerous pivot.
I need you to pay super close attention to this part, because this is literally the most dangerous legal shift in the entire directive. Historically, right, if an employee claimed they were facing pay discrimination, the burden was on them to prove it. Well, the new directive completely flips that on its head. Now, if an employee simply makes a claim, the burden of proof shifts entirely to you, the employer. You have to prove the absolute absence of discrimination. Think about that for a second. If your company doesn't have documented, rock-solid, objective pay criteria, you have zero evidence to defend yourself in court. You literally lose by default.
Finally, Section 5, why businesses must act. Look, businesses and institutional investors have to act immediately because the compliance workload isn't shrinking just because a few countries hit the snooze button. It's accumulating. Multinationals need to trigger an immediate action plan. You need to conduct comprehensive pay equity audits, rigorously revise your job frameworks to clearly define work of equal value, update your hiring practices to ban salary history questions, and build an overarching compliance plan that you can tailor locally. And if you're an institutional investor, you've got to be paying attention here. This gender pay gap data is about to become completely public. Any portfolio companies out there with unresolved pay gaps and no documented plan to fix them are going to face brutal investor scrutiny and, eventually, regulatory penalties. Preparation is quite literally your only defensible move.
And that brings us to the end of our explainer today. But I want to leave you with one final thought, a question that really gets right to the heart of that shifting burden of proof we just talked about. Think about your own organization, or maybe the organizations you invest in. If an employee challenged your pay structure today, could you objectively document and prove that it's fair? The window to confidently say yes to that question is closing incredibly fast. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.